Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast. We have a fun episode for you today with Ethan Nicolle, the creative director at the Babylon Bee. Ethan, I'm so glad that you've joined us today. We're going to talk about G.K. Chesterton. We're going to try to get some inside scoop on the Babylon Bee, but we're really glad you're here. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on. We had you on, and so now I get to be on, on here.
Yeah.
Right here.
Yes. Got to have you here.
Cool.
So, Babylon Bee, I've told my husband, is one of the platforms on social media that keeps me sane. So I'm constantly, and here's the thing, I'm constantly seeing these posts come down my Instagram. And every time I'm like, how? How did they come up with this stuff? So how do you come up with this stuff? Are you all sitting in a room and you just see something that happened in the news and you're like, that's going to be a great Babylon Bee piece?
Most of our writers are doing normal life. So they're working their jobs, their normal jobs. We only have, I think we have 2 dedicated writers maybe that on articles. We have Kyle, the editor-in-chief. It's his only job is making, it's really, he has more than that, but his main job is putting out articles and then gathering what the other writers have come up with. And so we get a bunch of guys who just, they get paid a bit to throw ideas at us. And they're guys that, have those funny thoughts. And I think that's one reason the Babylon Bee rings true with a lot of, it feels, a lot of the jokes feel like that, the joke you make while you're at work after you hear the news or whatever. And it's just kind of, I think because that's what it is. It's guys, we're all texting to each other and they're all over the US. So all spread out.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, tell us a bit about yourself. You have kind of an interesting background some things you were doing before you got to the Babylon Bee that other people may know you from. So tell us a little bit about that.
So, I go back into comics as the main place I got going. My first real success in comics came when I created a webcomic called Axe Cop with my 5-year-old brother. And it went viral and it ended up becoming a 6-volume Dark Horse comic series and a TV show on Late Night Fox. Nick Offerman from Parks and Rec did the voice. This is a wild time. Suddenly all these, it was like I was on Twitter and suddenly everybody noticed me. I was a real person. Like they started talking to me, people I was a fan of, Patton Oswalt did a voice. This is crazy.
Yeah.
I ended up writing on Veggietales, the new one that everybody hated on Netflix. I was on the.
That's a good way to promote yourself. I wrote on the Veggietales that everyone hated. I
wrote the bastard Veggietales that everybody hates and wants nothing to do with, and the remake. And if you watch that show, there's a very huge amount of episodes. You'll see Ethan Nicolle pop up as written by. So you're welcome. And 3 years of just thinking about how can I get Larry the Cucumber to believe in Jesus today.
And there's all kinds of creative ways.
Actual torture.
Yeah,
right. But 3 years of thinking that thought, no matter how much you love the show, you shouldn't put anybody through that.
Sure.
So I went through that. And then I ended up at the Babylon. I've written for some other animation. And then I ended up at the Babylon Bee. I just so happened I lived 5 miles away from Kyle Mann, who became the editor-in-chief. I was the second employee they ever hired. I became the creative director. I started off just doing kind of more all the crazier Photoshops you see on the Babylon Bee, and I was like, we got to do a podcast. We got to make a giant book. We got to do cartoons. We got to do videos. So that's kind of been my thing. Like I've just been trying to break the Babylon Bee into all these other things. Because to me, I always, from the moment that I saw the Babylon Bee, I said, this is serving the audience that I've always wanted to serve. And I love the articles, but we can do so much more than this because it's a hungry audience that everybody ignores.
That's so true. So how would you describe the audience for the Babylon Bee? What's your target audience there?
I think it's people, anybody that watches the news and goes, huh? It's just like, what? I think it has become that. The Babylon Bee did start out in our, I think our main audience was evangelicals who went, huh? About church culture, like stuff like some of the funny things of the past, the way that worship leaders act, or some of the funny prayer circle stuff and things like that. Now, the Babylon Bee always made political humor at the same time. We always made jokes about what's in the news as far as like pro-life stuff or crazy things Obama said. But the audience really did take a shift I think partially as the Christian culture jokes ran out, there's this big backlog
Mm.
of jokes to be made from decades past that we just kind of got caught up on, I think. And you can only make so many skinny jeans jokes
Right.
about worship leaders. But there was this big shift where we were discovered or found by our audience has burst out into this. It's really, there's a lot of not just libertarians. I know we got some atheist fans. We got people all over the board. It's people that just feel like comedy should be free, should be allowed to make these jokes. We should be able to, there's this whole punching down versus punching up thing now, which is a very bizarre concept in humor, where it really kind of implies that if you can punch down, then there's people that are below you, which is a weird way to look at the world, if not kind of really hierarchical in a really bad way.
Yeah.
We're constantly told that. And then you have to think about if God or Jesus ever made jokes that can only punch down, right? So
I guess that's true.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So
what's your favorite Babylon Bee article of all time, or podcast? Or...
I mean, okay, so it's a very meta one, and a lot of us will answer this, and a lot of people hate this one. Because for one thing, a lot of people don't get it when they first see it, and then also we see humor everywhere, and we see humor on our own side at the Babylon Bee. And so there's one thing is we get pitched constantly the worst AOC headlines.
Oh, yeah. Because
there is the truth. The AOC says dumb things all the time. And so it's only right to make jokes about that now and then. And it's because it's funny. But then there's also jokes where you're making the joke that AOC is stupid, and you're also revealing that you're not that smart in the process. And so we did basically a headline mocking AOC, the bad AOC headlines that we get. So we're basically making fun of our own side. So we did this really stupid one where stupid AOC strangles herself trying to tie her own shoes by getting strangled or tied up in her own shoelaces because she's so stupid. It's this really long run-on sentence. And then the whole article is like, she ran into a tree, and the cop was like, because she was a dumb socialist, she ran into a tree. And it's just the dumbest, worst written article we've ever done. And the funnest part of it is you read the comments. And everybody who has the preconceived idea that it reveals like three types. There's either people that already think AOC is dumb, and anything that says she's dumb is hilarious, so they're applauding it as great comedy.
Yeah.
And then there's the people that are just like confused. And then there's the people that are on the left that just immediately think any joke we make is sincere and we are right-wing garbage. And so therefore, This is just a great example of how the Babylon Bee is terrible at humor. And so the joke's kind of on them.
But you were making fun of yourself.
We're making fun of ourselves.
Yeah.
And you'll see some people in the comments start to catch on to that. And they're like, if they're making fun of themselves, this might actually be really funny. And then they're like, it's like they're getting nervous.
Yeah. So theologically, how do you work that out? Because I know with what I do, I spend a lot of my energy online and, of course, my whole book critiquing progressive Christianity. And I don't do satire, sarcasm, and all that. So when I see these Babylon Bee articles come down, they make me giggle. But then I'm always conflicted personally about doing stuff like that. So how do you guys work that out theologically?
Oh, I mean, Kyle's way better answering these questions than I am. He went to Bible school, but
yeah, I saw in your book intro that you just went to community college or something.
Right, I went to
me too.
a little bit of community college. Yes,
that's right.
And it was for art at a really small town community college.
Yeah, I did 3 semesters, I think, of music major. Pointless.
Okay.
Yeah.
So. Yep, that's me.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for one thing, just the idea of the super nice guy Christian is not really in the Bible. That's not the So I mean, we have to kind of throw that out, like kindness, and also seeing your neighbor as equal to you and loving your neighbor as yourself. And that's one thing that's weird, right? Like we can't joke with each other. Like I want to be joked with, and I like joking with my closest friends. Yeah. So I think that we should be able to joke with. I think that's one thing that the other side doesn't really get. Is that when we make jokes at the left, we are doing kind of an elbow nudge, like, we're just joking with you. Yeah. They don't joke like that, so they can't see that. So I think that's one thing that makes it tough. But I love, we're going to be talking about Chesterton. He actually talks about in an essay that I cannot recall very well. It's not in my book, where he talks about the 4 kinds of satire. And he does talk about how there's one where you really do, you satirize, you tell the truth about the person and you satirize them. And he said there is a form of that is a form of loving your neighbor. And I wish I could eloquently put it the way that Chesterton did, but I think that there is jokes do bring us together and they make us there is mean-spirited jokes where you're trying to bring a person down. And I do think and I do think some of our headlines, I don't stand by every single headline we do. There's some that those guys liked it, I wasn't crazy about it, or I had one that they were like, no, and so that's obviously a fine line we always have to be dancing. But I think that the main thing is that when the headline is to take down the idea, not the person.
Yeah.
Or we're taking down the caricature of the person. So like, obviously we don't think that Joe Biden is a guy that just is, literally hides in bushes and jumps out and sniffs people's hair. But it's fun to joke about him being that because that's just a funny caricature.
Yeah. And honestly, I mean, if I was Joe Biden, I might find that funny just because of, I would hope that I would,
Yeah.
Sometimes when, progressives leave comments and they're like a jab, but they're funny, like I laugh at those too. Even if, I'm the object of the jab.
Right. Oh no, I love when a good, yeah. We read hate mail all the time on our show and we applaud it when it's really well done. Like we had a guy who had written us multiple emails. We recently put this on our YouTube channel, and over months and months, we hadn't been checking our Instagram instant messages. And so we went and checked them and found this guy had written many hate mails for months. And they got better as they went on, like he was practicing. And one of them said, "Go eat a sack of bees," we love that. It's such a great line.
Yes, go eat a sack of bees.
And he'd do some that sounded Shakespearean, he went into different styles. And
I don't know how you get all the bees in the sack, but that might be problematic.
Yeah. Hopefully you can buy them at a bee store where they're already bagged up.
Yes, the bee sack store.
Yeah.
Of course. Well, good. So you mentioned Chesterton. That's kind of the main topic that we wanted to talk about today. You've just released a book that's really a compilation of 14 essays of Chesterton, and it's called Chesterton's Gateway, 14 Essays to Get You Hooked on Chesterton. And I was so excited to talk to you about Chesterton because Chesterton is one of my favorite writers. Way back when my faith was reconstructing and I was just, this whole wide world of Christian writers that I'd never been exposed to before was opened up to me. I read Orthodoxy, and to this day, it's just one of my favorite books. But you've just released a collection of Chesterton essays in book form. So first of all, why did you decide to write this, and why do you think people need to get hooked on Chesterton?
Well, ever since I started the Babylon Bee podcast, I bring Chesterton up all the time, and I became a huge Chesterton fan. My Chesterton addiction, which is really what my book is, that's the whole joke. Drug addiction. Chesterton's get you hooked.
Yes.
You guys didn't pick that up. It's subtle. When I was living in Oregon, I had moved to Portland. I had been in a rock band, so we're musicians here, and living that life where like just enough success to not really be successful, but like we were making money and like playing a lot, and then we just put out like our first full length album. We've done 2 EPs, just living it, but then like also becoming exhausted by it. And then finally the band ended, and I found out through that I was actually an introvert. I always thought I was an extrovert, but I found out my whole fake social life was based on being a musician. I only knew how to talk to people that had seen me on stage. I didn't know how to talk to people on the same level as me. So I went through this whole weird depression and thing. And then I was in Portland, had moved there from a small town, and life started to feel really meaningless. I started losing my faith. And I don't even remember what sparked me to read Chesterton. I think I had read enough Lewis that I was like, I don't know, I need something else. I guess, and at the time, first time you hear Chesterton, you think, oh yeah, they hung out all the time or whatever. They didn't. Chesterton was the guy that Lewis, studied and copied a lot. So I started reading Chesterton, and one of the first ideas that really struck me, he talks in one of his essays about the family, about how the small community is really the more expansive place, the place where if you really want to experience humanity and the variety of humanity, you live in a small community, and even more so when you live in the family, when you get to know your neighbor. Because he's criticizing, I believe, Rudyard Kipling, who says you travel the world and you experience all these cultures, but you get to experience those cultures from this distance. You're observing them like a scientist. You're almost, you You could switch them out with penguins or whatever if you're in Jacques Cousteau, but they're just people they have no effect on you because they're just a thing to be observed. When there's somebody in your life, you have to actually experience them, and they can criticize you and have an effect on you. And so when I moved to Portland, he said that the city is a place built for narrowness. And I had the same idea when I went into Portland. I'm like, I'm going to meet all these people that are at comics, and I'm going to have all these friends because I'm from this tiny town where everybody just kind of laughs at the whole idea that I'd ever make a living with this stuff. And I found a ton of comic artists who, if I had been honest about my beliefs, like the slightest, would have just kicked me out because they were completely narrow and on a whole different worldview. So I started to realize this narrowness of the city. So that was one of the first big ideas. And then he started talking about wonder and about how wondrous the world is, not how wondrous we're going to make it or by believing in ourselves or your imagination is. Like this actual world right now is like, just think of a leaf. Think about all the intricacies and the beautiful designs, just in the little vein patterns. Like I started looking around me at the beauty around me. That's a big Chesterton idea, is we need to shrink ourselves back down, see the world as large, because we've grown out of proportion to it. And that I never looked at humility. You look at humility as being this like kind of groveling, like, I'm sorry that I suck kind of thing. And but the idea of humility as becoming, a kid in a tiny cheap garden in an apartment complex, shrinking down to a pygmy and suddenly realizing he's in this massive wonderland and seeing the world for the creation that it originally was, seeing that, the rivers running with water, in the fairy tales they run with wine, only to remind us how amazing it is that rivers run with water, or that apples are gold in fairy tales to remind us that how wondrous it was the moment we found out they were red. Just the idea that he talks about, again, another thing he talks about is Elfland. The idea that there's so many things in this world that we take for granted, and we assume they just like that because they were supposed to be. Evolution says every single thing that is just had to be that way. That's just how fate decided it should be, and it robs us of that kind of that wonder of how amazing it is that the sun is in the sky every day, and the variety of creatures that are around us, and all the beautiful colors. And so he's very good at getting into that stuff and writing about it beautifully and also really hilariously.
Yes, he is very funny. A lot of people may not realize that if they don't read him a lot. But you mentioned that you were in Oregon and the Depression hit, you started losing your faith. What was it, do you think, that started causing your faith to unravel? And what did Chesterton specifically, I know you've touched on humility and wonder, but was there like an aha moment when you're reading Chesterton that maybe helped give your faith some more stability or help build it back?
I think the wonder and the wonder stuff, like, just looking at life as it is. And also because Chesterton has a big way of, a lot of apologetics give you arguments out of logic and reason of why it could be true there's a God or whatever. Like, they're usually not the arguments that you go through to get to your belief. A lot of times they're ones you can add to it to strengthen it. And Chesterton does a lot of breaking down of our already held beliefs. Like, he really questions reason and logic. Like, he really pokes a lot of holes in it. And I had been down this road where I had really gotten into apologetics, and in order to practice, I'd read a whole bunch of apologetics, then I'd go on an atheist forum, and very politely, but like, I would try to address their answer, address even the meanest ones, just for my own practice. I'd write like essays worth of like, comebacks, and try to be funny and have fun with them. Yeah. And it was really a learning experience, but I also really did realize that like, a person who's really good with words can argue for anything. I started getting really disillusioned with using reason and logic and argument, and I was on this high, and I came down from it. And so that was part of where I had come from. I was also in that, once again, I was in that weird depression where just my sense of myself, suddenly realizing I was an introvert, I just lived alone for a long time. So I was in a weird depression there too. And I think a lot of the good things that come to us in life, we tend to let that become what we think of our relationship. I look back over life and how often was my relationship with God a girl I had a crush on, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think I was going through something similar to that, where the thing I was considering my relationship with God was really a high I was getting from being in a band that was doing pretty good, and weird stuff like that. So I was being brought back down to earth, and Chesterton was the guy walking me around earth. Wow. as it has always been, and saying, look at what has been here since all of eternity, and you've been looking past it at a rock band.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating that you brought up how he would critique reason and logic, because when I discovered him, I had come out of a lifetime of being an artist, a creative, flaky artist, led by experience and emotions. And I discovered the intellectual side of my faith as an adult, and Chesterton really bridged that for me. So, like this quote from Orthodoxy, he says, "Imagination does not breed insanity. Exactly what does breed insanity is reason. Poets do not go mad, but chess players do. Mathematicians go mad and cashiers, but creative artists very seldom. I am not, as will be seen, in any sense attacking logic. I only say that this danger does not lie in logic, but in imagination." And for me, my faith had been under fire intellectually, and so I was looking for some help. Right? I was looking for some help. Like, have I been crazy my whole life that I've just had this beautiful relationship with the Lord, and now the intellectual arguments are being stated to me that that's all ridiculous and that nothing's as I thought it was and the Bible can't be trusted and all of this stuff. And it was like Chesterton gave me permission to be an artist and not feel stupid for being an artist, And so for me, that was like a lifeline, that quote. And it's interesting that he sort of bridged that. And he is so logical, though, too, at the same time, which is so interesting because he's kind of critiquing. And I think what he's critiquing is just that, plugging everything into a computer and get a formula out of it. And that's just not the way life works. It's not the way God works. And so it's interesting that in both of our journeys, sort of he bridged something for us. He kind of walked with us through that. And that's part of the reason I love him. And I just, I picked up Orthodoxy because I started to see these quotes from Chesterton all over the place as I learned apologetics, and apologists would always be quoting him. And so I want to get into these 14 essays that you've compiled for people, because I think that if people watching or listening are anything like me, you can go on Kindle and there's the complete works of G.K. Chesterton, and it's like a million things. Where do you even start? There's fiction, there's essays, there's books, there's all kinds of stuff. And then, some people are like, well, he was Catholic, and he did become Catholic later in his life. And there's all kinds of like roadblocks for people where they're just like, I don't know where to start or what the value is in this. So I love that you're like, hey, start here with these short little essays, and we're going to maybe talk about a few of those. But when I read Chesterton, it was as if I was reading somebody that was writing right now in 20, well, it was more like 20, probably 15 when I was reading him for the first time. But maybe you can help us understand what was going on in his culture, in his time, that was maybe inspiring him to talk about, just in Orthodoxy, he talks about original sin, free will, intellectualism, polygamy, materialism, pantheism, progressivism. And I think, one of the big ideas of the book ultimately is how boring, predictable, and just easy heresy is, and how the difficult and intellectually and artistically fulfilling road is orthodoxy, right? And so what was going on in his culture and his time that was provoking some of these ideas?
Well, he starts the whole book off where he's walking down the street with a publisher, a famous publisher. He's published a lot of big books. And he says, the publisher says something like, that guy will get on well. He believes in himself. And then, Chesterton notices a loony bin cab going by from a place called Hanwell, an insane asylum. And he says, where people really believe in themselves is the insane asylum. And so he gets into this idea of, you want to meet somebody who really has a worldview that's all airtight and you can't poke a hole in it, talk to an insane person. And we've come this, and he comes from modernism, things that work. That's the important thing, is if it works. And then it becomes if it works for you. And as things move on philosophically. And so that kind of became the value. This works, so we'll do it. So, and a lot of times it's one thing. So he calls it monomania, having one idea and then making an entire worldview out of that. So, you can see this in determinism. Determinism just becomes this very, and he says the reason he calls it a circle is because a circle doesn't have to, isn't necessarily giant. It can be tiny. So you can have a worldview that's airtight. You can't poke a hole in it, and it's this tiny, tiny worldview, And so the determinist has to throw a lot of things out of truth. Ideas of beauty and truth, goodness, these things that we just have to take for granted, love, they're all just kind of byproducts of this deterministic, a bunch of particles falling down a cosmic staircase and just happening to happen the way that they are. So that's a big one. He gets into that, and he talks about how people pick one virtue and leave all the other ones out and kind of go down that rabbit hole of where it's just pure charity or pure love without judgment, and that's one thing where he gets into is the Christian faith is where is the only place he sees where two ideas can coexist: full love, full forgiveness, full mercy, full judgment. And I think that's so he paints this picture of the circle being kind of the Eastern idea of kind of this just all-encompassing view of the world through one idea, and then he talks a lot about paradox, which is tough, especially when you want to be purely logical. Mm-hmm. Points out all these paradoxes and things that he has a whole chapter on it, which I did put in my book. And it's the hardest chapter in my book, I think. But he talks about the cross having that paradox right at the center, and it can go out forever. The four arms of the cross can continue to grow. So it's not a thing. There's mystery. And so I think that's one thing. He puts logic back in its place. So when he talks about Elfland, I also have that chapter in my book, The Ethics of Elfland. And he's not saying that logic is bad or you shouldn't use reason. He's saying put it in its right place. So he says, in Elfland, yes, apples can be purple or gold, or you can have tigers hanging by their tails from the trees, but 3 tigers are 3 tigers. Like you can never have, 2 plus 2 never equals anything but 4 in Elfland. Because there is logic and there is reason in its rightful place, but there's never some logical explanation for why a chicken lays an egg. Like it's just, an egg doesn't imply a chicken. We don't know why that. It's just kind of cool. So he takes those things and he says, like, there's a creative element to the universe that isn't purely logical. Mm-hmm. And part of that is mysterious. Like, and I guess if you're a person that's purely deterministic, you have to believe that everything, all of the strangeness of the universe is pure. There's a purely logical reason it's like it is. And Chesterton denies that.
For anyone listening or watching who isn't familiar with that term determinism, help them understand what that means.
It's pretty much the idea that, think Calvinism without God. Yeah. Everything is, it's not, except it's not predetermined. There's no being predetermining it. It's the same thing as, rolling the dice. The universe is a billion pieces of matter rolling, and somehow through the actions of different chemical reactions, everything that's happening right now really couldn't have happened another way. We're reacting chemically. Me and you are having this conversation based on chemical reactions. And so there's free will is just it's a myth. It's not real.
Yeah.
It's an illusion.
Interesting. I'm going to go here next because of some things that you just said. He's talking about keeping things partially mysterious, but yet I like how he keeps categories where they are. Like I think it's in Orthodoxy where he talks about the giraffe and he says, if you don't draw an animal with a long neck, it's not a giraffe. I mean, that's my great Chesterton paraphrase because I don't have it right in front of me. But, basically the idea is you got to call it something else. And that's something in progressive Christianity, the point that I try to make is like, if you're going to redefine Christianity and you're going to disagree with Jesus, you should not call it Christianity. You should call it something else. That's a different category. It's a different something. And so I wanted to ask you about this because I talk about the work of Richard Rohr a lot. I try to explain to people why I believe that his work is unbiblical and why this is not an Orthodox Christian view of Christ and of the world. And in his book, The Universal Christ, he actually quotes Chesterton to support his ultimately his view of the world, which is panentheism. And that's just generally the view that God created the world, but he exists in it and as it. So kind of like a hand fills a glove. He calls the universe the body of God. Gotcha. Creation is the first incarnation, but Christians kind of mix it up. We think that Jesus is the main deal, but it's really creation and this Christ this cosmic Christ is in all created matter, and we just need to grab hold of it. And in the book, Richard Rohr even dedicates the book to his dog and calls his dog the Christ. So like that's the end game of that. I feel like there's maybe a Babylon Bee article in that somewhere. But in sort of supporting this idea, he quotes Chesterton. And here's the quote he uses. He says, and this, by the way, on Kindle has close to 3,000 highlights. This quote that I'm about to read to you. So people his fans really loved this.
And this is a Chesterton quote he uses?
Yeah, well, it's the Chesterton quote and then his comment on it.
Okay.
So it says, as G.K. Chesterton once wrote, your religion is not the church you belong to, but the cosmos you live inside of, end quote. And then his comment is, once we know that the entire physical world around us, all of creation, is both the hiding place and the revelation place for God, this world becomes home, safe, enchanted, offering grace to any who look deeply. I call that kind of deep and calm seeing, quote unquote, contemplation. And so then he goes on to talk about the essential function of religion is to radically connect us with everything. And so he just goes on and kind of unpacks his panentheistic worldview, which really, at the end of it, he even says there's no atonement. You don't need atonement. You don't need to be saved. You just need to realize that you're inherently connected with God already. You've never been separated from God. And he quotes a lot of dead guys to support his views. And I sort of feel like if Chesterton were alive, he would push back on being used to support that worldview. And I wonder, how does that hit you? Rohr using the quote, your religion is not the church you belong to, but the cosmos you live inside of, in essence, to defend his sort of cousin of pantheism, panentheism.
Right. I mean, it's a jump to say that, because Chesterton's obviously saying your religion, and he's jumping to your God is everything around you. And then, so it kind of, because that whole view of the God is everything, it kind of just, it's kind of like that idea that everything is unique. There's never nothing unique. Like if every single thing is God, is that just another way of saying there isn't a God? Like I get lost in it. It's a nothing statement to me. So I think Chesterton is saying, we tend to not tie our beliefs to reality. We make it all about the religion and what the religion makes us look like and how we look to our neighbors. And he's saying, my religion is wrapped up in the, just the beauty of the sunset or the children and the things around me. And we lose sight of that. And your faith should stick with you even if your church shuts down, kind of thing. It shouldn't be a club you're in. I went through that. I was big in Young Life. I met Christ through Young Life. And when I left Young Life, because I didn't know if I could be a Christian without it. And it was really hard for a while because it was this club and it was like everybody had their own same way of being. And, I think every group like that has the dangers of turning into a cult because people get very afraid of getting out of that because they become very safe with everybody thinking the same, becoming narrow.
Yeah, and it's almost like, as I read through Universal Christ, it's like he's taking a legitimate concept of the book of nature, right? The heavens declare the glory of God. There's actually, Romans 1 tells us there's things we can know about God by looking out into nature, even, his essence and some of his divine attributes. And I think Rohr is like saying, that's more important than the Bible, because he does say that. He's like, basically implies the Bible's just this thing that was written in the last nanosecond of history. So like, we need to look at this other thing that Christ just fills and animates in some way. And I was sort of, when I saw that he was using Chesterton to support that, I was like, maybe you could quote somebody who's alive, who's here to defend themselves before you do that. All right, so let's talk about some of these essays that you're saying, hey, start here. This is a good place to start in understanding what Chesterton was all about. The first one is called Tremendous Trifles, and this was written in 1909, and I think that was right about when Orthodoxy came out. I believe, maybe it was 1908 was Orthodoxy. The quote you start with says, the world will never starve for want of wonders, but only for want of wonder. So tell us why we should read Tremendous Trifles.
All right, real quick, just what inspired me to write the book is through being on the Babylon Bee podcast. I'm quoting Chesterton like crazy. I started constantly getting emails. Where should I start with Chesterton? I have another podcast I did for a while called Audio Mullet. We talk about Chesterton in there too. So just getting this question all the time, and it's hard because there isn't a great book to recommend. Orthodoxy is really hard. It is a must-read, but a lot of people read it and put it down and have no idea what they just read, or they don't make it all the way through. And one thing you learn about Chesterton after reading a lot, and so one of the things I did, because I had such a tough time grasping Chesterton, is I talked a bunch of my friends into getting together. This is pretty nerdy, but we all got together, smoked cigars, and read Chesterton together. And it caught on, and it became a group of guys we'd meet every Sunday. It grew into a group of, like, on average, 20 guys. Cigars, whiskey, and Chesterton. We'd read a few chapters, and we ended up going through over, like, probably a 3-year period, reading a bunch of his books. I've read some of them multiple times. I ended up recreating a group like that. I moved out here to little more eastward from Los Angeles, and when I joined the Babylon Bee. So we have a bunch of the Babylon Bee guys and a bunch of other guys at a cigar shop after they closed down. We now are like 4 books in on Chesterton. But one thing you learn when you get that far in is you realize Chesterton was an essayist. Like he rocks the essay. That's his art form. It's not the book. Like the book, he has amazing books, but there's going to be essays or chapters that make no sense to you and chapters that stick with you. You're generally going to remember your favorite essays or chapters of Chesterton, not books.
So he would have been a perfect blogger right now. Like if he were
he's
alive
a
today,
journalist.
he would
I mean,
be
his main. Yeah. He wrote like 5,000 articles, I think, or crazy amounts. He wrote 100 books, but he wrote something like 5,000 articles for newspapers on top of plays, on top of novels, and everything else he did. So I'd always write this email and like, well, this is a pretty good essay, but like, here's a bunch of essays you should try out. And then I always want to kind of give them an introduction. And then I knew when they're going to read it, there's all these things that could be footnoted because there's a ton of references he makes from both having a classical education and knowing things like, Greek mythology and Shakespeare and all this stuff. And then just stuff from his modern time. Stuff was in the news in his time, but isn't now. So, and then I started thinking, well, there's got to be a book that is like, if you want to get into Chesterton, here's where to start. And I started looking, I couldn't find one. There's so many Chesterton books, and you can read all this stuff for free, but there's no gateway to Chesterton book. Mm-hmm. And then he also, one of his most famous concepts is Chesterton's fence, where he says if there's a fence there, probably the person who knows why it was there should be willing to tear it down, not just somebody who just doesn't like it being there. It's kind of a picture of tradition. It's probably his most famous analogy. So, and I like puns, Chesterton's Gateway was the name of mine. And then, once again, it's a drug reference.
Yeah.
So I decided to make it, and I had fun with it. I got to be humorous with I did 400 footnotes. So there really shouldn't be a spot you get to and you have to stop and Google anything. I also broke up the big walls of paragraphs. So tremendous trifles, all to get to that. To me, this is probably the easiest, and it's probably my favorite, even though it's really simple. It's a fairy tale. It's very short. But it's this very simple fairy tale that really kind of illustrates his ideas about humility and wonder really beautifully. It's a fairy tale about 2 boys that are playing in a little garden in their front yard, and a milkman walks up, who is of course a fairy, and asks them if they each have one wish, what would it be? And one wish is to be a giant, so he becomes a giant, and he strides these long strides, and quickly realizes that everything out in the world looks like the little garden he was just in. The little faucet in the garden, that's the Niagara Falls now. Little bit of cork, that's the Grand Canyon. He's just basically shrunk everything down, and he just becomes depressed, falls down, and just ends up getting his head chopped off by a backwoodsman, kind of a fairy tale style. And so then the other kid wishes to be a pygmy, just to be a tiny little bug-sized man. And suddenly Chesterton goes in this long description of how beautiful that garden that he already was in becomes, because he became more within proportion to his universe. And then he goes in this whole beautiful thing, and he talks about that's why the devil wants to take you up to the heights, up to the top of the mountain to look down. And he wants to look down on everything. He wants to feel bigger than everything. And so just those simple ideas, he very beautifully and humorously writes. And I do think he makes almost no strange references to anything. And there might be like 2 footnotes on that one. And one of them might just be, isn't this great? So
yeah, I know. The footnotes are great, by the way. They're kind of keep it moving, and they inject a little extra humor there. You mentioned that he was really big on talking about the family. And so one of the essays you have in your book is on certain modern writers and the institution of family. And the quote you have here to start is so good from Chesterton. It says, "The best way that a man could test his readiness to encounter the common variety of mankind would be to climb down a chimney into any house at random and get on as well as possible with the people inside. And that is essentially what each one of us did on the day that he was born." Tell us about that one.
Yeah. Well, that's when I was talking about, where he starts off talking about how the big city is a place created. What does he call it? He calls it a place made, not an antithesis, against Christian knowledge. It's not against. The way he puts it is like, for the suppression of Christian knowledge, or basically to narrow us into our little views. Because you think about, you move to a city, and your little tiny strange hobby you have, you can find a group of people that think just like you. You can play it totally safe and not ever have to encounter some, your strange neighbors or whatever. And but when you live in a small town, you have to get to know your neighbor. And I related this because I came from a very small town in Oregon, and I had friends that were senior citizens. I had friends that had families, and I was friends with their kids. I had this variety of friends. I had friends that were different races and things like that we never would have become friends if we lived in a city where everybody segregates off into these groups. And so that rung very true for me when I had just moved to the city. So that was a big one for me on that, but then also just the idea of the family being the most romantic adventure you can go on.
Yeah.
Because that is the opposite of what we're taught to think of it as.
Totally.
And
yeah.
we want to escape it. And his only point is, his main point in this essay is, don't fool yourself by thinking when you leave the family and go off to the big city that you're going to experience more of humanity and that you're being brave and you're taking on the world. Like, no, that's what you left. Like, you left behind the bravery and the taking on the world and the romance. The city's a place to go find your niche and lock yourself into it and grow as little as possible.
Yeah.
He's not saying the city is necessarily bad, but that it can be used badly, especially if you're not self-aware enough to realize that that's what most people do when they move to a giant metropolis. They narrow themselves, they don't grow.
I was thinking about that concept the other day. I was out walking, and I was thinking about my grandpa, who all of his life, essentially, and all of his married life, worked 3 jobs, typically, construction. I mean, he would, dig holes for plumbing, and he gladly and happily, and never heard him complain about his job, because his life wasn't about his job. He did the job to provide for my grandma and to provide for his kids and his grandkids. And I thought about how radically different that is than what we're being taught today. Like, the world tells women that if you choose to stay home and keep a house and take care of your children, and that, like, you're missing out on life. Like, life's out there, and you're stuck here doing that stuff. And even to men, the lie would be that, your life's really about that, getting that promotion, getting that job that really fulfills you, really satisfies you, and then you kind of do the home thing in between before you go back out and do your job. And it seems to be that's the message we get today, and it's just flipped on its head. It's backwards, because as we know, the family is so important, and that's really what it's about. And I love the way he frames that. Like, that's the great adventure is the family, and that's why we do all the other stuff, is to be able to participate in the family like that. I love that about him. And then, of course,
he really defends that in What's Wrong with the World. He really goes into that. Some really good stuff on that, because his whole idea, the family is the point. You go out to work and to defend and do everything you do. The man does that to defend and preserve the family, not to go out there and escape from it.
Right.
If you're doing that, you're doing it wrong.
That's right. So I'll ask you about this one. This was one of the Chesterton quotes that I immediately read this quote years ago. And I was like, I love this man. Like, this is a person I want to read more about, and I want to get to know as best I can. And so you have one of the essays to read is called Cheese. And this quote is just the best. Poets have been mysteriously silent on the subject of cheese. Excuse me. Got a little cheese in my throat. I don't know what that is. Yeah. But so talk about that one.
It's a simple essay. It's really fun to read. It's really about him So we actually had Dale Ahlquist, the president of the G.K. Chesterton Society, on the Babylon Bee podcast yesterday. And in honor of this essay, we ate cheese and bread together. And we had two platters, because in the essay, he's talking about his experience going to all these little villages throughout England as he's touring around doing speaking. And he says, in each town, you stop and you ask for bread and cheese. And they bring you bread and cheese, and it's completely unique to that area. So every time you ask for that simple two things, bread and cheese, you get a full unique experience that gives you the tastes and the textures of that place. And it's just this special, wonderful thing that he loves. And then he goes to London, the big city, where everything's becoming commercialized and mass produced. And he asks for cheese and bread. And he really goes off on this part of the essay where he just kind of loses his mind when the waiter walks up with some kind of mass produced cheese and crackers, which he calls biscuits. And he kind of lays into the poor waiter about how dare you pair cheese and crackers. And he says, did the Lord at the table, okay, and this is not an exact quote, but basically says, when Christ at the Last Supper, did he have the ridiculousness to offer biscuits? It just goes on. So the idea that you could ever replace bread with crackers. So it's this funny thing, but it is also about how in the race to like modernize everything, we're losing our souls. And he's lamenting that. He wants to hold on to that. He wants people to see. Because in all of his political stuff, when he's trying to push for a political view, he never wants to force anybody. He wants people to see it. So his real goal is to change the people so they can see why be localized, why buy locally, and why try to resist the oversaturation of giant corporations or big stuff, big tech now. I mean, he would have been freaking out over that stuff, but he never wanted to force it through government. So I think that cheese is his lament that people stand in. I think naturally tend to go towards getting this. He compares it to soap. He says that soap, everywhere you go, it doesn't matter if you're in China or India. There's two kinds of soap in the world right now. There's two giant companies. You're going to get one of them, Brown Soap and whatever that one was.
Yeah.
He says soon it's going to be like that with cheese. And he's kind of right. I mean, they got like Velveeta and stuff. The nice thing is that you can get lots of varieties, but
Cheese Whiz. I mean, he would roll over in his grave if he knew about Cheese Whiz.
Cheese Whiz. Yeah.
I love the way this one starts. It says, my forthcoming work in 5 volumes, The Neglect of Cheese in European Literature, is a work of such unprecedented and laborious detail that it is doubtful if I shall live to finish it. I love that. That's so great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, in a moment, we are going to go to our Patreon-only portion of our discussion. So if you want to know what that's all about, it's basically just an after-party hangout time where if you're in the Patreon Facebook group, which you can go to and get access to by going to patreon.com/Alisa Childers, you get to select the questions that we ask our guests in our kind of hangout after-party time. So we're going to go to that in just a moment. Again, go to patreon.com/Alisa Childers, and you can check out the different tiers. And if you want to support us, you can choose a tier. And I think it's tier 4 to get access to all of that. But you can get early access, and there's a Facebook group you can be a part of. You can select a tier, we'll get a free book. You can take a look at all that at patreon.com/Alisa Childers. But as we close out this portion, Ethan, if anyone is not already convinced to get your book and start with Chesterton. If anybody's not convinced, give us your best pitch. Why should they pick up Chesterton?
Well, this has everything I always wanted in a Chesterton book, and it's not too much. It's also, I think that a lot of Chesterton books. I'm showing off. Sorry. Yes. So I'm also an illustrator. So I illustrated the cover.
Oh, really?
I did all the little illustrations inside on every chapter as an illustration. You never get a Chesterton book with images in it, because they're just all public domain walls of text. And then also one of his essays in the book is about drawing on brown paper and how you need white. You need the color white to do that. And so in order to illustrate, that's why I did this. On brown paper, it's just pure black, pure white. But to show what white does on just black. With black and brown, it's a very dead, flat drawing. You add that white and it just bursts out. And so there's There's one in there called A Piece of Chalk where he talks about that. So I think that, along with, I think, footnotes, but also these aren't scholarly footnotes. These are, practically, I'm not a stoner, but, kind of like a slacker guy going like, let me Google that for you. And then I'm like, I don't know how to say this word, but I think I got the gist of it. All right, keep reading.
Yeah.
So, and even I've gotten some great compliments on the audiobook is me reading it.
Oh,
and when I get
good.
the footnote, there is that inflection of better footnote that. And then I'm looking it up. I'm like, okay, maybe we get it. Let's keep going. So it's just
That's
a very
great.
casual. So I think it's Chesterton without anybody too scholarly. Like I said, I didn't go to school for this, and also very casual, fun. And I've never seen a heavily footnoted Chesterton. I've seen lightly footnoted. This one gets to everything. I mean, I even footnoted Edgar Allan Poe just in case. Like every little thing, I was like, yeah, we'll just cover it. And then collections of essays are the best, I think. And especially if you've never read Chesterton, at least from my perspective, this is a great place to start.
Love it.
You're gonna find at least 1 or 2 essays in here you love.
I agree. And definitely cheese. You're going to love cheese.
Yeah.
All right. I want to thank my guest, Ethan Nicolle, for joining me today and talking about one of my favorite writers, G.K. Chesterton. Pick up the book. Let me get that title again. Chesterton's Gateway, 14 essays to get you hooked on Chesterton. Definitely pick that up on Amazon and check out the audiobook. Sounds fun. That audiobook sounds awesome. If you are watching on YouTube, please subscribe. Click that bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Always helps if you comment. And if you saw this post on social media, to like it and share it is helpful as well. If you're listening on audio platforms like Google, Spotify, or iTunes, really helps if you go over and leave a great review. Helps with all those algorithms and stuff. But for now, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.